Hello, everybody, and welcome. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good middle of the night, depending on what your time zone is. And welcome to another edition of Community Central. For today's edition, we have our special guest, Simon Wardley, who is the author of the theory called Wardley Mapping, which is a way of looking at how an organization exists within its conceptual space in both relationship to other organizations and in time. Which, for those of us who, like me, are community managers, is one of the ways that we look at how our own projects and organizations exist. And he is going to explain that in detail. As usual with Community Central, the way to ask questions is through the Q&A pane that you should have usually on the right, depending on your browser. So ask questions there. We will be queuing questions until the end of the main presentation, at which point Simon will answer them. This video will also be shared online. We're recording this and we're going to share the video online, so if you do miss something, you'll have a chance to catch it later in the recording. So with that said, welcome, Simon, and thank you very much for presenting this for our audience.
Absolute pleasure. Yes, absolute pleasure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're coming through loud and clear.
Wonderful, super. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share my screen, and we'll get this presentation up and running. On a second. Share. And let's go find the presentation. I'm running on a MacBook. Can I just double check you can see that as the whole screen, an introduction to Wardley Mapping?
Yes.
Wonderful.
It's right there. Terrific.
Good, right, fantastic. Now, mapping itself is an enormous field. I mean, I map nation states. I use it for mergers and acquisitions. I map individual industries, individual companies. You can map political systems, cultural systems, knowledge, all sorts of things can be mapped. So it's a big, big subject. And when it comes to things like, in terms of using it to anticipate change, there's a large number of what we call climactic patterns. I will mention those which are used to anticipate change. There's about 30 of them. There's about 40 principles of doctrine, which are ways of organizing, and I will mention some of those. And there's about 100, well over 100 different ways of manipulating a space. One of my favorite, which is to open stuff up. So I will briefly mention those, but what I want to emphasize is this is an enormous subject, and we're going to try and cram a lot in 40 minutes. It is all Creative Commons, so you can go help yourself, medium.com/Wardley Maps. You'll find all the details there. So let's get started. I'm going to talk about where it came from, the issue of strategy. We'll get on to maps. I'll talk about what are the most common problems that I see, which is trapped by context. Then we'll get on to patterns. And then if we have time, which we may or may not, we might get into something like serverless and other things that go wrong. So to start with, where it began was 2003, 2002. I was working for this company, for Tango, online photo service, about 16 different lines of business, and many millions of users. But it was profitable. Revenue was growing. We also did a lot of consultancy type work, but it had a big problem. And that problem was this person, the CEO. The CEO we had was what I would describe as a fake CEO. They were making it up as they went along. They didn't know what they were doing, but despite this, we were still growing. Now, I can say that with some confidence that the CEO was making it up because I was the CEO. We had lots of wonderful vision statements and things like that, but our company is agile, will lead an open source effort of the market. But I literally pinched these from other companies. So 2003, our strategy is customer focused. We will lead an innovative effort in the market through our use of agile techniques and open source. Literally just pinched from other companies with a few words changed. So I was a little bit concerned that people would eventually rumble that I didn't know what I was talking about. So I started reading everything I could on the subject of strategy, and I started going along to lots of conferences, recording CEOs talking about strategy. I used to take a tape recorder with me, a digital one, and record the common words. And I called these common words that people use business level abstractions of a healthy strategy, or BLAS for short. And I've done this every couple of years. So example, this is probably about 2013, 2014, common BLAS were digital business, big data, disruptive, innovative, collaborative, competitive advantage, ecosystem, blah, blah, blah. I mean, if I did it today, you could add in AI, blockchain, all those sorts of words in there as well. And then what I did was I took all these different documents companies produced and created a BLA template. This is my strategy BLA template. Our strategy is BLA. We will lead a BLA effort of the market through our use of BLA and BLA to build a BLA. And then I simply smashed the BLAs and the BLA templates together and auto-generated 64 random strategies. So this is complete random nonsense. Our strategy is customer focused. We will lead a disruptive effort of the market through our use of innovative social media and big data to build a collaborative cloud-based ecosystem. I did 64 of these. I sent them around and I got 400 responses back. And every time I've done this, I've got similar responses. The responses were about 3 basic types. The first was, this is the exact wording from our business plan. The second is, I've seen 2 of these used already. And the third being, are you for hire? So a friend of mine's put this all online. This is strategy as a service. If you ever need a strategy, just type in the URL. It will automatically generate you one based upon nothing whatsoever. If it makes you feel comfortable, you can pretend there's AI and blockchain behind it, whatever you wish. It's simply just smashing a few words into a BLA template. And if you don't like the strategy, our strategy is collaborative. We will lead an open effort of the market through our use of big data and social media to build a digital business. If you don't like it, just simply press refresh and it will create your new one. So I was getting to the point that I knew I was making things up. And I was starting to feel, well, maybe I'm not the only person doing this. Because I seem to be able to just combine, it just seems to be random words smashed together. So I was a bit lost, and I ended up in a bookstore, and the person who was running the bookstore, very fine person, suggested I read a book by Sun Tzu. Actually, she suggested I get 2 copies, 2 different copies, obviously being very good at book selling, but because they're different translations. So I picked up a copy, 2 copies of Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and it was in reading the second translation I noticed a couple of things. The most important of which was Sun Tzu was fundamentally talking about 5 factors that mattered in competition. So number 1, have a purpose, a moral imperative. Number 2, understand your landscape and the space you're competing in. Number 3, understand climactic patterns, so how the landscape is changing. Number 4, understand doctrine and principles of organization, how you structure yourself. And number 5, you get into the leadership bit, which is where the gameplay. I quite like that categorization. And then I came across John Boyd. Now, John Boyd was a US Air Force pilot, and he's very famous for the OODA loop, which has become popular in many circles, including political circles these days. Now, I've really simplified and taken a whole bunch of things out of the OODA loop, but basically you have the game, you observe the environment, that's the first O. There are many feedback loops in this. The first O is about landscape and climate, so observing that. Then you orientate yourself around the space with doctrine and principles, and then decide where you're going to attack, and then you act. And it's a cycle. You keep on going round, but as I said, there's many feedback loops in here. So I was quite excited. I showed this to others, and they were like, well, it doesn't matter. Strategy is all about the why. Well, that's an interesting idea. But the problem with it is, if you think about the importance of why, there's the why are we doing this stuff? and there's also the Y of movement. So if you think about a game of chess, your Y of purpose might be to win the game. Your Y of movement is, do I move this piece or do I move that piece? And it's through movement and action that we actually learn, assuming that we understand and can perceive the environment. So I have my cycle, you have the purpose, the game at hand. The first step is to observe the landscape, and also that includes climactic patterns, so how the landscape is changing. Then you need to orientate yourself around it with principles. Then you need to decide where to attack, and then you act. And it's a cycle, and we're constantly going through this Y of purpose and the Y of movement, as in our moral imperative, and then Y attack this space over that space. So I was quite happy with that. I was quite excited. I thought, well, that sort of makes more sense than anything I've been using beforehand. And because it's a cycle, I also know that if I keep on going around, it's like playing a game of chess, then the more I do this, the better I'll get. So this brought me then on to the question of maps. The reason for that is the first part of that cycle is understanding the landscape. You know, we having a purpose, but then understanding the landscape you're competing in. And so that drew me into the subject of maps and the subject of situational awareness. Now, this is a map. This is a map of an old Roman city. It's very visual. On the map, there are a number of different points. There's about 20 points of interest. There's 5 residential areas. There's 5 points which look like they're of military interest. Now, if I just take those nodes and I describe the journeys between them, as in A to B, then there's about 870 paths with those nodes. So if you described it in 25 words, as in go up to the Colosseum, turn left, you could describe the journeys there with about 20,000 words. And if I try to do every permutation, so A to B to C to D to E with words, an unbelievably huge number of Wikipedias, trillions upon trillions. So the first thing you learn about maps is they're incredibly dense sources of information. And more than that, they also allow you to go and explore, so you can go off the beaten track. If I try to describe the permutations of all the paths in words, that still wouldn't cover the fact that I could just walk off a path. But there's another side to maps which I liked as well, something else I'd noticed. If I give you directions to a place on a map, so to go from one place to another, you have to go through these different paths. I can look at the map and I can say, well, surely it's quicker to go this way. And we can have a discussion and an argument about the map. One thing I'd noticed myself about stories, and we were heavily using stories for navigation, is that if somebody gave you a story of how to do something, if you challenge the story, you're actually challenging the storyteller. In fact, we have entire industries who make huge amounts of money trying to persuade people that the problem with the stories is they're a lousy storyteller. And if only they were a better storyteller, then their thing would succeed. The maps took a lot of the politics of discussion away, because we're no longer fighting over stories, we're fighting and discussing the landscape. So what is a map then? Now I've told you why they're interesting. What is a map? Well, these are 2 identical graphs, by the way. Folkestone to London to Dover, 115, 124 kilometers, and the one on the right-hand side, it's an identical graph. Now I'm going to do something magical. I'm going to turn them into 2 different maps. Ready? Go. There we are. These are 2 different maps. Now, the difference is I've added a compass. And the result of adding a compass is that space now has meaning. So if I move the pieces on a map, it changes the context and meaning of the map. It's a bit like taking an atlas. If you move, say, Sydney next to San Francisco, it changes the meaning of the atlas. And because space has meaning, we are now able to explore the space. So what do we have in business? Well, I had loads of maps. I had business process maps, I had mind maps, I had things called strategy maps, I had systems maps. And I'll show you an example. This was a systems map for one of our systems. Customer requires photo storage, website, runtime, compute, etc. I've simplified a lot, and I've highlighted a box, CRM. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move that box. There we go. So I've moved that box. How has the map changed? And the answer is, it hasn't. See, the one thing that all of these maps had in business in common was that none of them were actually maps. They were all graphs. I'm afraid in business, we keep on using that word of maps, and it doesn't mean what we think it means. So when I started to explain this to people, they would say, well, we're competing against others. You're saying we can't see the landscape, we don't have any maps, so what? We survive. Well, I survived as well, very profitable and so forth. And it's fine to not see the landscape if you're competing against others who can't see the landscape as well. It's perfectly all right to be hopeless at stuff, as long as everybody you're in competition with is hopeless as well, because then no one gains an advantage. And it's problematic when people start actually seeing the environment. Now, there's a wonderful study for those of interest by Marcus Pfizer on the use of variance decomposition in the investigation of CEO impacts. And what the study was looking at was how much of an impact do CEOs make, and can we rule this out from just random chance? And I think it's about 70% or so you cannot rule out from random chance, which what that basically means is the impact of a CEO is fairly random. And that sort of stuff you would expect if you're operating in environments where you cannot see the environment at all. Like a general going, let's bomb a hill, and no one, just find a random hill and bomb it. It may work, it may not. It'll be pretty random. And if you're competing without seeing the environment, those are the sorts of effects you would expect to see. And my favorite example, because I went back in history and started to look at the use of maps in military history, is the Battle of Thermopylae. So Themistocles, ancient politician, Greek general, had a problem. 140,000, 170,000 Persians were invading. What he decided to do was to block off the Straits of Artemisium, force the Persians along the coastal road into Thermopylae. It's a narrow pass where a small number of troops could defend against a larger force. So he used the landscape to his advantage. Now, there were about 4,000 Greeks in there, including 300 Spartans. That's where we get the tale of the 300. Now, I want you to imagine you're members of the Athenian city-state. It's eve of battle. I'm Themistocles. I'm giving you purpose and moral imperative, the why of purpose. We want to defend against the invading Persian horde. But then I say to you, I don't understand the landscape. I don't understand the environment. I don't have a map, but have no fear, for I have created a SWOT diagram. Strengths, well-trained Spartan army, high level of motivation not to become a Persian slave. Weaknesses, E4s might stop the Spartans turning up. A truckload of Persians are turning up. Opportunities, get rid of the Persians, get rid of the Spartans. We're Athenian. We don't like the Spartans. And the threats, the Persians get rid of us. And Oracle says a really dodgy film might be produced in a few thousand years. Anyway, the point about this is, what would you use to communicate and determine strategy in battle? Position and movement described by a map or some sort of magic framework like a SWOT diagram. Well, it's pretty obvious. You'd use a map. But what were we using in business? I'm afraid we were using magic framework. We didn't have maps. And that seemed to be one of the core problems and the reason why everything seemed to be gut feel. Because if you can't see the landscape, you can't see climactic patterns, you can't see principles of doctrine, you can't see and learn gameplay, all you're left with is purpose, action, and gut feel. So how to map a business? Well, the characteristics of a map are pretty simple. First, you need an anchor. So in the case of a geographical map, you need a compass. Next, you need position of pieces relative to a compass. And lastly, so this is north, south, east, or west of that. Lastly, you need to have consistency of movement, i.e. you need to be able to say we're going north, and for north to mean we're going north, not to mean suddenly we appear south because of some sort of magic teleportation. There's got to be consistency of movement. So anchor, position, and movement. So what I decided to do was I took my systems diagram, one of them, well, I took several, in fact, and I thought, right, what is the anchor in this systems diagram? Now, often we'd have many anchors. We could have the customer, we could have business, the business itself, we could have regulators. So in this case, I'm just going to take the customer and put them at the top, and that is my anchor. Now, that customer had certain needs. So they needed to print, online photo storage, online image manipulation, all sorts of things, needed to get access to a website to do those things. But that website had needs. It needed runtime. Maybe we needed some sort of CRM service. It needed compute. That needed a data center, needed power. Remember, this is back in early 2005 when we're all building our own data centers. So what you've got is an anchor with a chain of need. Now that doesn't really give me position, but fortunately, the website is more visible to the customer than the power that I use to power my compute, which powers the runtime environment, which powers the website. So what I've got is almost a metaphor for distance, which is visibility. So if you think of somebody going into a tea shop, I want a cup of tea. The cup of tea is very visible to them. What's not visible to them is the power used to heat the kettle, which converts cold water to hot water, which is then used to make the cup of tea. So the power is is not visible to them, but what's near to them, the website is. So what you can do is order this list in what we call a partial ordered chain of needs. So customer, online photo storage, website, runtime, compute, etc. Now I've put an axis on the left-hand side. That's completely training wheels. It's total scaffolding. Doesn't need to be there at all. It's just to point out that things further up the chain are more visible than things lower down the chain. That's all. So what you've got is a partial ordered chain of needs, and now we've got anchor and position, but we're still missing movement. It took me about between 6 and 8 months to work this one out. It turns out that all forms of capital seem to have a common pattern by which they evolve. So this is work that I published about 13, 14 years ago now. It starts off with the genesis of novel and new items, custom-built examples, products and rental services, commodity and utility services. So simply by moving the pieces of the nodes to where they need to be, I now have what we call a map. I have anchor, position, and movement. Okay. So the first thing that happens with these sorts of maps, because what's the point of doing that? Well, it's a very quick exercise, actually. And the first thing is it enables communication and helps people overcome something which I call trap by context. So to explain that one, I'm going to use the example of an insurance company. So this particular insurance company had a problem. First of all, it was rapidly growing, so that's not a bad problem. But because it was growing, it needed more compute. So it had a process flow, compute needed, order server comes into goods in, then they would modify, mount, and rack it. Now they had a bottleneck around the area of modifying, mounting servers. And so they spent 6 months roughly putting together a business case, lots of financial figures and SWOT diagrams for the investment in robotics. And it was several million, but it had a return on investment sub 1 year. Sounds very exciting. So I asked them to map it, and we spent about 15 minutes mapping this space. Now, to begin with, of course, there's a bit of resistance because they got their plan to build the robotics. Anyway, so they start off by mapping. They go user needs compute. They put compute in a product. I would argue even back then it was more of a heading towards more of a commodity, heading towards utility. Order server goods in. The distinction between server and compute doesn't make a great deal of sense, but all maps are imperfect representations of a space. What they're doing is they're forcing you to put your assumptions down. And then they went rack, mount, modify. Now remember, this was about 15 minutes, and they'd spent 6 months putting these cases together. And I looked at the map, and of course one question stood out. Why have you got racks and custom built? And they said, well, we have our own racks. We have a company that makes them for us. Okay, so what are the modifications you're doing to servers? Well, they don't fit our racks. So we have to take the cases off, drill new holes, add new plates in order to get them to fit our racks. Now, that's why you need robotics. Yes, that's why we need robotics. Now, you could see in the meeting at that time, it was suddenly dawning on people, hang on, that doesn't make sense. Of course, the obvious thing is to use standard racks back then. This is what we call managing evolutionary flow. So when things are custom built, if there's commodity versions available, try and use the commodity versions. And of course, the investing in robotics made no sense at all to them. But the reason why it made sense to them before they'd mapped it is what they're focusing on is improving process flow, getting rid of bottlenecks. And this is probably one of the most common things that I see in business. People spending vast sums of money, hundreds of millions, if not billions, optimizing process flow for exactly the wrong and the most ineffective process possible. What you need to focus first on is optimizing for evolutionary flow, so using more commodity rather than custom built, and then worry about the process flow. So once you do that, of course, compute, you could then more easily argue it's a commodity, and you end up with this situation. The process flow that they needed to focus on was more on the commodity side. And of course, by then, people like Amazon EC2 was all out. So that's the sort of stuff that you should be doing. What you shouldn't be doing is investing in robots to basically modify servers to fit into your custom built racks. Another example of this is to do with weighing scales, a fairly simple example. What you had was an agency produces a count for another government department, and it gets this figure from weighing scales. So what do I mean by this? We have produced so many paper forms, it's cheaper to weigh the paper forms to work out how many paper forms there are than it is to physically count them. So that's what they do. They weigh huge numbers of paper forms to work out the count. And what they want to do was a digital transformation program in order to improve this. So very simply, I asked them, okay, they map it out, here we are. So I go and have a look, and I say, where are the paper forms coming from? Well, they were coming from goods in. So I go and talk to goods in. Where are the paper forms coming from? Distribution sites all over the country. Very good. Go and talk to a distribution site. Where are you getting the paper forms from? We're printing them out. We're printing them out from our CRM system, which our users are filling in online. So users are filling in online a system, and then you're printing out the forms from that system, which you're sending to this other group, which you don't know what they're doing now. But what they're doing is they're weighing the number of forms to work out the number that you and many others have printed out. I mean, the entire lot can be replaced by select count star from table. And there's huge amounts of infrastructure and all the rest of it, and a digital transformation effort in terms of using digital scales. It just makes no sense at all. But again, what you've got is people trapped by context. They're all optimizing their local area. So once you get over that and start communicating, then you start to learn common patterns. So you've got your purpose, you start to understand your landscape. Your purpose can be pretty all over the place to begin with. Remember, it's a cycle. The more you go around, the better you get. You start to observe climatic patterns. So the first set of, these are, by the way, rules that influence the game. That's what I mean by climatic patterns. You can't ignore them. They will happen to you whether you like them or not. So the first one you sort of come across is everything evolves. If there is supply and demand competition, your map is not a static thing. Those components will move. They will become more commodity-like. The second pattern that you learn is that past success breeds inertia. So we get very good at doing something. We have a lot of capital invested in that space, and that can be political capital, physical capital, it could be governance and procedures. That creates inertia to a change. So classic example, Blockbuster, Netflix. Who was first with a website? Blockbuster. First with video ordering online? Blockbuster. First with experimenting with video streaming? Blockbuster. Who went bankrupt first? Blockbuster. They out-innovated everyone, but they went under because they had inertia created by a past business model, which was based upon late fees. So basically forgetting to bring your cassettes into the shop. The next pattern you notice after that is as things evolve, they enable higher order systems to appear. So they increase the efficiency which we can build things. So bricks enable us to build houses, nuts and bolts enable us to build machinery. We call those new things the adjacent unexplored because they're often highly uncertain. They're electricity enabling boxes with moving pictures to radio to refrigeration blankets. You don't know which one's going to succeed. Those higher order systems, they will create future sources of value and worth. All right, so once you've got that, what you can do is you can take a map and you can apply those patterns to work out where to invest. So back in 2005, which is when we produced the first map, we were going, right, compute we think is going to go to a utility. I thought it was going to be Google at that time. It turned out it was Amazon the next year. We know the runtime will eventually follow that way as well, being built on computers utility. So we could either invest there, we could differentiate on our existing service, or what we can do is we can wait till somebody else has played those games of industrializing those two components and build something novel and new on top. So now we're having a discussion about where to attack, and that at the board level, that includes finance, marketing, operations. We're all talking about a single landscape with a single map. So why not here? Why not invest in this stuff? Well, one thing that we knew is we could do, and that would be looking at optimizing process flow, but the key was to manage evolutionary flow first, process flow second. So if the change had started to happen, we were going to have to adapt rapidly to that change. And so we came up with our plan in 2005. We anticipated a bigger player would do the utility play. So we built the first, runtime as a utility, JavaScript front to back end, billing per function. So a real true serverless environment that you can build entire applications. I built a trading application in a couple of days on this environment. It was known as Zimkey. We'd opened it all up. We had a particular ecosystem play, which we won't go through. It's a gameplay called ILC, which is all about letting people build on top and mining metadata to spot future patterns. So that was our play. And so we launched, that was EuroOSCON 2006, rapidly grew, a large number of companies building, or a large number of developers building all sorts of new applications very rapidly. Of course, by then, Amazon had launched, so we quickly converted to run the entire environment on Amazon. Unfortunately, the parent company had a big US strategy consultancy firm come in and explain that the stuff that we were doing, which was 3D printing, use of mobile phones as cameras, and also this cloud stuff, was not the future. You're getting it all wrong. Let's go 3D television. So we all shut it all down and spent a vast sum of money on 3D TV, which was a bad move. Well, I didn't actually stay for that. I decided I would leave. One of the things, I had a very comfortable offer to stay, but I was just not interested. One of the things about the maps is when you create a map and put your gameplay on it, in a way that I've never done with business cases. I've never gone back and looked at past business cases. I look at past maps all the time. They're a very effective tool for learning about what's changed, and because you can see the context and your decisions at that time. So I took those sorts of gameplay. I went to Canonical, provides Ubuntu. Quite interesting. The first 5 people I met in 2008 said, "What are you here for?" I said, "Well, I'm going to take us into the cloud." And it was like, well, that's just a fad. No one's really interested in that, which was quite amusing. It didn't take us long to convert that mindset. We created maps of the entire space, worked out where to attack. We were literally about 3% of the operating system market against yourselves, Red Hat and Microsoft. It cost me $500,000 and took me 18 months to take us from there to about 70% of all cloud computing. So literally we were able to take, and we played all sorts of games using other companies, including Red Hat's own inertia against each other. And that was all through the use of the maps. So literally we were the minnow, and 2008 to 2010, if you remember those days, we went from being nowhere to literally dominating the cloud space. After that, I could have quite easily stayed with Canonical. Mark's a great person to work with, but I wanted to do something out of the tech space. I had written something called the Better for Less paper, which was used by in UK government to help create something called spend control, and to also help support the formation of something called GDS, Government Digital Services. So I've used a lot of the mapping stuff in government spaces where we've used it literally to save hundreds of millions to billions, and in some cases to save lives. These days, mapping has spread to things like the UN Global Platform. The new statistics Bible that's coming out has mapping, an entire chapter on mapping. There's academic papers as well from places like the LSE, and then there's people teaching at Harvard Kennedy, or LSE, UCL, even Beijing University and Moscow. So mapping itself has spread. It's still a relatively new field. Now, a couple of things about maps. You've got to remember they're all imperfect representations of the space. And it's also a model, so it's wrong. So if you can accept the fact that all maps are imperfect and wrong, it turns out they can actually be quite useful for communication, for learning, for gameplay, for getting people to common understanding of a space. So once you get over the sort of landscape climatic patterns anticipation, you get into the doctrine space. And these are principles, universally applicable principles, regardless of context. So what I mean by that is when you look at a map, you've got certain patterns which you cannot influence. They will just happen. Like everything's going to evolve if there's supply and demand competition. And there's 30 of those, they're climatic patterns. And then you've got patterns you can decide to implement. Now, some of them, about 40, are universally useful. So they're things like focus on user needs, remove bias and duplication. Turns out that's a good thing to do. Majority, however, are context specific. So things like doing an open source play are context specific. They work on certain parts of the map. So these are the universally useful ones. An example would be that as things evolve, it becomes efficient, enables higher order systems to appear more quickly. Those things evolve. And when those things evolve, their characteristics change. So if you start off with money, starts off in the left-hand side, uncharted space, chaotic, uncertain, unpredictable, ends up being highly industrialized. Same with penicillin, computing, whatever. Because of that, there's no such thing as one-size-fits-all methodology. So what you have is extreme programming, very good on the left, Six Sigma, very good on the right, Lean's very good in the middle. And that's the same with purchasing. There's no such thing as a one-size-magic-fits-all method to purchasing or to project management. And so an example of this would be HS2, high-speed rail, a big heavy engineering project, about 70, 80 billion. This is the systems diagram for creating that entire railway in a virtual world. Now, how would you go about building this? Well, we could outsource it, we could build off-the-shelf products, build it in-house, maybe use a combination. The problem with using a combination is there's 387 million permutations of that diagram alone. So how do you work out what to do? So fairly simply, James Finley, who's the CIO, spent Sunday afternoon, turned it into a map. That's the map. Now it's really easy because you just outsource the stuff on the right, off-the-shelf products in the middle, left-hand side, agile in-house development. Okay. Vendors tend to hate this. Vendors hate it because what they really want is for you to outsource the whole lot in a highly specified contract to them. And the reason for that is fairly simple. You want a contract because you want to know what's being delivered. You can only specify the stuff on the right. Stuff on the left-hand side is constantly changing. and so you will incur excessive change control cost. It will just massive cost control overrun. And so that's the sort of typical scam that you'll see that goes on, and it gets worse when somebody on your own side says, next time we need to specify it better. So that's just an example of doctrine. And then you get into gameplay, and as I said, there's 100 of those. We certainly don't have time to go through all of those. So just to summarize, there is a cycle to strategy. Start off by understanding your landscape. Learn about climactic patterns. That'll help you anticipate change more effectively. Then you get into doctrine. There's about 40 of those. That will help you if you break things down. Quite simply, if you think small is one example of doctrine. So break it into small components, use appropriate methods, then you're more likely to have success with the project. And then the final stage is gameplay, which we won't touch upon. These are the ways which you can manipulate the environment, and there's lots of them. And on that note, I'm going to hand it back.
And that is awesome. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yes, we have some questions.
Good.
So I'm going to go ahead and read these out for you. First, Matthew asks, you've been recently debunking culture as a point of pride for companies. As community leaders, how do we nudge towards a healthy space without using our own equivalent of blahs?
Oh gosh. So yeah, I've known for quite some time that you can map political systems and various other systems. I've been trying to find a way to express that without exposing, enabling people to do all the evil stuff. Unfortunately, there's a harmful stuff that goes on. I singularly failing to do that. But so when we come to a thing like culture, anthropologists have spent 100 years trying to define what culture is, and we've currently got to the position that no one can agree. And part of the problem seems to be we're trying to explain something in terms of words, and it's not amenable to words. There is a way of mapping all the components that are seem to be involved in culture. It is a visual representation of culture. It is very imperfect, as with all maps, but the beauty about it being, despite the fact that it's imperfect, it enables other people to add components to improve the map. So I don't think we'll ever get to a good enough description, verbal description of culture, but I do think we will eventually get to a good enough map of culture. Now, the reason why you want that is if we want to improve or find out what impacts our environment, our culture, then we have to have some way of at least describing the space, whether it's a verbal story or whether it's a map. And so you have to at least have some mechanism of visualizing or seeing the landscape. So that's what I've been doing in terms of maps of culture. And then once you start doing that, you notice there's all these sorts of connections between components. So, for example, everybody runs around saying, let's do the Spotify model. Well, that's just a structural model. And there are so many other aspects in terms of the actual principles, enablement systems. These are communication mechanisms, the values of the organization, the memory of the organization. And these are all influenced by the landscape and the sense of belonging. So you can't just simply copy somebody's structure and expect to turn out to be like them. The other thing you also learn is there are various feedback loops and ways of reinforcing that positively, but they can also be quite negative as well. So this depends on things like gameplay. Some gameplay is quite positive, some can be quite negative. So if your value is honesty and you use misdirection, that's going to get stuck in your memory. It can become your organizational memory. It can become a myth, and that can have a negative impact on the sense of safety and belonging people have to your organization. So the answer is there's no simple answer. There is a way of mapping culture. It is very imperfect. It will get better over time, and from that we can use some basic lessons. Sorry, that's an egg timer that I've got going off in the background. I hope that sort of helps as a quick sort of introduction to culture.
Yeah, well, thank you. So we got a second question from Ryan.
Yeah.
who asks, it seems like for any business, the anchor would be the customer. Is it useful at times to manipulate the map by changing the anchor?
So
Go ahead.
yeah, so many times when I'm mapping, I will use maybe the business itself, because you don't want to forget the business, the customer. It could be regulators, could be governments, it could be all sorts of people who could be anchored. There can sometimes be different types of customers as well. Um, remember, this is maps in the geographical field. We go all the way back to the early Babylonian clay tablets, lines in sand and stones. I mean, this is more where these maps are. They're not like Ordnance Survey maps. We've got a long, long way to go. Okay, we're not going to take thousands of years. It might only take us 40, 50 years, but we've got quite some way to go before we really get those maps defined. So there is no perfect answer. A lot of it is just experience. And the best way of getting to a good map that I found is simply spend a short amount of time mapping the space and share it with others. Because it's the process of sharing, others communicating, challenging your assumptions, and coming to a common understanding is how you make a more useful map.
Thank you. Let's see. One other question here from Dave. What other books would you recommend as an introduction to business strategy besides Sun Tzu, Machiavelli, and Boyd?
Well, Sun Tzu, Boyd. There we are. That's two good ones to start with. I think every book has the most you can hope for. I tend to hope for from a book is one good idea. It may not even be the idea the author was actually expecting to communicate, but it's something that I've got from a book. It can often be there's an awful lot of wading through treacle sometimes. I mean, I see these wonderful books which say these are the characteristics you need to be successful. You know, the top 10 list of successful whatever. Here you are, follow this and you will be successful. And the interesting things about those is when you look at the list of companies, they often say these are examples. And particularly if these books are like 10 or 15 years old, you'll often find those companies, many of them have gone. And you'll often find when people talk about characteristics, it's no different between those who succeed or fail. Those who fail actually had the same characteristics as well. So I think a lot of the time people are looking for magic answers, simple solutions. The reality, even with maps don't tell you what to do. All they do is show you a landscape to which you need to apply thought. And I think there are some basic things that we can say in terms of doctrine. It's a good idea to think about user needs, remove bias and duplication, etc. And it's a good idea to have high situational awareness. That turns out to be useful. But there is no sort of magic answer how to make yourself successful. It's like a game of chess. You've got to play the game.
Okay. Tombin asks, how do you deal with granular feature investment decisions? Say the commodity solution is missing one feature that would add significant competitive advantage, but to get that feature, you'd have to re-platform. What's a Wardley mapping example of how to figure this out?
Wow, that's an interesting one. So if we take something like, something like power, very much a plug. You might be able to say we've got this one feature. If we change plugs, put a fourth pin or a fifth pin or whatever, it's going to change the way we distribute things and everything else. So it's going to make things fantastic. The thing is, in the mind of the consumer of that service, it's become a commodity. It is it's highly industrialized, highly standardized. There's many components built on top of it, an entire chain built on top of it. So would be huge reluctance to change those things. So it tends to be the case that the only time that changes is with government action. So another example would be you can take something that is a commodity and persuade people that it isn't through creation of artificial needs and marketing. So my favorite example of that would be Gary Dahl. So Gary Dahl took ordinary builder's rubble, rocks, put a rock in a box with some straw and a leaflet and sold it for $20 a pop, called it a pet rock. So he's creating a completely, artificial need and marketing what was just a rock, which you could have got, they weren't even cleaned. You could have just got them from your garden, but was selling them for $20 a pop. And you see a lot of people trying to do that manipulation, sometimes for amusing reasons, sometimes, for purely commercial reasons. So when things are commodity, it can be difficult to move them. We often justify to ourselves this feature would make the difference, but it's once you get a chain built on top, it would be very difficult. The only other way, the best way of getting it to move is that you push the perception of the users so far up the value chain that no one's looking at that space anymore. So, and then you can make it, so it's like with power generation. I mean, nobody sees the innovation that's going on in power generation because they've just got a socket. So if I take it in the compute world, I mean, if we take compute going to utility, so that's EC2 dominates that space. Then we talk about, if we move up the stack, what we've got is the runtime going to a utility. So we've gone from .NET, LAMP to Lambda. And Lambda dominates that space as well. So if you were going to shift it, you would have to go up the stack further. So not rather than just doing runtime as a utility, you'd attack the space of, say, conversational programming. And that's already happening now with people building AI-based systems on top of Lambda, which you can speak to. And you can say things like, build me a website that collects airline information. And the system will go and build you the entire website for you, because it's actually a learning system. So that there's a lot of stuff in that in Belgrade and other places that's going on, really exciting stuff. But if you wanted to change those lower components, you would own that space.
Cool. Okay. So one question, I'm going to paraphrase William here a little bit and say, is there a place where we can find example maps?
Oh, well, there's a chap called John Grant. If you, my Twitter is Swardley, Swardley, at Swardley. And if you look at my pinned tweet, there's a link to a GitHub page, which is a community page maintained by John Grant and others, which has lists of like the Slack channel and all these other different resources for maps as well. I mean, most of my maps are like pen and paper type things, occasionally in Keynote. There are people, Rainmaker's got a tool out there for mapping. The LEF has got a tool. Well, it's part of DXC, so they've got a tool, internal tool for mapping, which was external at points. You've got other companies out there building tools, but it's still early stages. There isn't a sort of canonical repository of maps. And that sort of stuff can be useful because if you have many maps, you start to find the same component being repeated over and over again in different maps, and its position being different. And that can tell you two things: duplication and also bias. And it's also useful for anticipating when something's about to make that shift to utility, and so potentially where you want to build a common service for others to use. Okay. So look at my pinned tweet, and you'll find links to the GitHub. There's an awesome list.
Okay, this is presumably not the one that says "I like ducks." Oh, that's your profile.
Yeah. So if you go, if I go to my Twitter handle,
yeah,
it's just the first.
Cool. Okay.
Should be the first pinned tweet. There you are. There's a course by Chris, Wardley Maps, Pragmatic Wardley Mapping. These are both online courses. The Awesome List. And there's a book as well. 600 pages. Okay. Just help yourself. It's all Creative Commons.
Yep. Awesome. Well, thank you very much. I think we're out of time for questions. Yes, Brian?
Okay.
And thanks, everybody. As mentioned before, this has been recorded. It will be both internally in Red Hat at Mojo, and then later on put up on the Red Hat community YouTube channel,
Good,
so that you
right.
can watch the recording if you missed anything, if you came in late. And of course, for fill-in, Simon has tons of stuff online. So now you've got 600 pages of reading to do. So thank you very much, Simon.
Pleasure.
That was super helpful and like amazingly educational.
Thank you very much. My absolute pleasure. You take care.
Okay.
Do-do-do.